So let's have a look at the Sherman DD. Now, oddly enough, I don't know why they did it, but they called it the Sherman DD. DD stands for Duplex Drive, and I'll explain Duplex Drive in a minute. But Duplex Drive isn't the most obvious feature of the tank. The most obvious feature, clearly, is the amphibious screen, and that isn't mentioned at all in the title. I always thought that was rather odd, but there we are. The idea of a tank that could float, I mean, bearing in mind this is a 35-ton tank, that a tank could be floated by simply increasing the displacement around it was an idea that was conjured up by a chap called Nicholas Straussler, who was a Hungarian who'd become a naturalised Brit and who was behind this idea. It isn't perfect, not by any means, but it was adequate, shall we say, for D-Day and that sort of thing. You've got a screen made of canvas. For a start, they've bolted a skirt around it, or a false deck if you like, just to prevent the thing from leaking at the bottom. It's erected by air inflatable tubes that run up the sides, and they're inflated for compressed air carried at the front, and they raise the screen. But on a Sherman like this, at the lowest level, you've got 3 layers of canvas between here, the inside and the outside. There's 3 layers. Then when you go up one, over the first of these ribs, the side is made of 2 layers of canvas, and at the top, where it doesn't matter so much, it's only 1 layer of canvas. So that's typical of all of them. Now this one is an M4A2. That is to say, it's the diesel Sherman. They also had Sherman DDs on the M4A4, which was the one with the spaced out suspension and the Chrysler multibank engine, and the cast hulled M4A1. So those were the main 2 DDs to begin with. The Sherman M4A2, or Sherman 3 as it would have been in British service, came in a little bit later. They were certainly used at the Rhine crossing and other actions over that way, but not so much on D-Day. Try to ignore the window in the side. It was put in there so that the curious could gawp in, and has nothing to do with the original tank at all. It's just to give a view inside for people who wanted to know what it was like inside. And I can tell you it's bloody uncomfortable inside. Most of the crew, although they weren't necessarily supposed to, tended to come out on what they called on deck when the thing was floating. The only chap who had to sit in his seat was the driver. He had to be there to control the tank and drive it through the water. So he had to sit in his seat no matter what. And he was the only one who really had to struggle to get out through the hatch when he needed, when the thing started to sink. Everybody else preferred to travel on deck, and they found that when they got into rough weather, they could put their backs up against the screen and prevent it perhaps from collapsing. So it did help having them out, but it meant that they all had to scramble into their places the minute the tank got ashore, because then the screen comes down and the tank starts shooting. And this was the great secret of them. They could, in the water, they looked like nothing more threatening than a canvas boat. But when they reach the shoreline and the screen collapses, they suddenly become a tank, which is, with the gun pointing forward straight away, is ready to fire. And that's the reason that they were so successful, because they got ashore with the leading infantry on the first wave and were going into action pretty well at once. Sometimes they were taken all the way in by landing craft if the sea was too rough to launch them. But if they were late, then all that shooting had to be done by the Sherman crabs. It was all right, it could be done, except that they had other things to do when they were there. The idea was to go down the ramp. They went in by landing craft tank Mark III, which had the room inside. They carried 5 tanks per landing craft, which isn't very many, but they arranged them sort of herringbone fashion along the deck so that they would get out easy, because coming out that entrance of the landing craft is the trickiest part. You've only got to go a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, and you catch a tank on something like the projecting parts of the ship and tear the canvas. And if you do that, you're lost. If you came off centrally, the tank would go down the ramp, down some extension ramps and into the sea. Now they liked to have the tank in second gear at that time so that it could move away from the ship, because all the while it's going into the water, it's being pushed back by receding sea, and there's always the risk of doing some damage. But so they wanted it to get away from the ship as quickly as possible. Although, funnily enough, one or two of the commanding officers found it was preferable to go in the water in first gear when you got a better pull to get away from the ship that was behind you. The landing craft had stopped by this time, hove to, as they would say in the naval terms, and that's when they launched the tanks into the water to do their swim ashore. They swam in from any distance, really. The Americans at Omaha actually started to swim in from too far out, but it was so choppy in that part of the front that most of the tanks were overcome by the sea and sank. And although the sea was rough, some of them managed to swim ashore for about 3,000 yards or something like that, which is quite a lot. But it can be done if you're careful, and you don't lose too many tanks that way. But that's how they operated. Now, what we want to do is to talk about how the thing's driven. And to do that, we need to go round the back and have a look at the props and how they're arranged. The problem that Straussler had to begin with was that the Sherman, which was the chosen tank for the DD on D-Day, has the gearbox at the front, so he couldn't run a propeller off a gearbox here at the back. And because of that, they had to come up with this most devious system for driving the propellers. The tank goes into the water, and while it's in the water, the tracks are thrashing around the whole time. They're driven by the drive sprocket at the front, like any Sherman. And that's how the tank propels itself in the water and on land, of course. But the idea was that later on they fitted the rear end round the idler with a separate sprocket, and this actually carried the drive. It was driven by the tracks, which is really odd for a sprocket. A sprocket's supposed to drive the tracks, but this was driven by the tracks, and it worked a shaft that ran through the middle of it and went through 90 degrees in a bevel box and out to the propellers. So the propellers are actually driven by the tracks going round in a rather indirect manner. You've got two propellers there, each one driven by one track on one side. The propellers are designed to hydraulically lift if they needed to, so that when the tank came ashore, it didn't drag anything up with the propellers. They disengaged from the drive and were, in a sense, stowed in underneath a little bit. That was one of the ideas anyway. The other thing is the propellers take care of the steering. Now, the steering of one of these things is quite a business. There's a platform on the back of the turret, and that platform is occupied by the tank commander, who has an enormous tiller bar over his shoulder, and he can use that tiller bar to alter the direction these are pointing in and steer the tank. And they say it's steered fairly accurately. The driver also has a hydraulic means, a little lever, which he can use to do the same thing. But obviously with the commander up there, the driver can't see a thing, doesn't know where he's going. Whereas standing on this platform, the commander can just about see over the edge of the screen and can see which way he's heading. But that's how the steering worked. They came up with this idea of a thing called belch, which sounds a bit disgusting, but never mind. Belch worked on the principle of having a pump, and the pump squirted water through holes that were around the screen at the top. So you had a kind of spray of water coming out. And the idea was, off Studland Bay, they'd had a defensive system meant to roast Germans alive, which involved setting fire to the sea, which doesn't sound very clever, but you floated oil on it, set it alight, and a huge cloud of smoke came up, and with belch squirting out, the tank could pass through that perfectly safely. Came out the other end filthy dirty, but at least it was in one piece, and that's what belch did. They never actually used belch, but it was designed for that purpose. The other thing you'll find is that after they've come out the water, was to cut away the screen and use the tank as an ordinary tank. The reason for that was that they had a theory that when the screen collapsed, as it did, when you stopped putting compressed air through it, when the screen collapsed, it dried out and became an excellent target for a portable flamethrower. And they didn't want their tanks catching fire, so they normally cut the screen off. And I don't blame them. You couldn't use it twice anyway. You very rarely found a DD tank that was used more than once. Now, the interesting thing is, there were quite a lot of regiments of these. The British regiments had 2 squadrons of DDs, 15 tanks per squadron, but their headquarters and the 3rd squadron was invariably with wading tanks only. That was the way we did things. The Canadians also had swimming tanks, DD tanks, and so did the Americans. D-Day was the highlight of the DD tank, really. The interesting thing is, however, that those regiments were all trained by 79th Armoured Division and were all part of the 79th Armoured Division during the training. Most of their training was done at Fritton Decoy in Norfolk, which is a secluded inland waterway where they were able to train sort of away from the public view. And then they went to train in the sea, and they trained in the Solent, in Scotland, off South Wales, all over the place, where there was all kinds of ocean and so on to deal with. But the Solent was one of their most popular areas. And the other one was Studland Bay, just outside Poole Harbour, where a lot of them were sunk at one time. But for D-Day, they were added to, DD regiments were added to ordinary tank brigades. They no longer formed a part of 79th Armoured Division. 79th was responsible for training them. An amazingly number of regiments that were trained and never actually went into DDs. They were also prepared in the Far East, actually in India at Kokonada Beach. But the idea was to use some of them in Burma, but they didn't. There was no need. They had a device in Burma called topi, and topi worked by, when the screen was folded down, as it normally was, you had a steel sort of shuttering that fitted over the screen to protect it from the bushes, which it would sort of scratch against as it went along. And when you needed to put the screen up, the topi just unfolded and fell down the sides like that. So again, it was never used, but you do see it now and again, see pictures of it and so on. And it makes quite an interesting thing. But in action, they were no longer any part of 79th Armoured Division. They were attached to individual tank brigades, usually 1 or 2 DD regiments to a brigade, and that was all. Once they were ashore and the screen was off, they became ordinary tanks, fighting like any other tank and not really needed for DD work again. Usually once was enough, and I can understand it as well.